Yes, you're absolutely right. Of course, what happened in the United States was a very good introduction to what we're talking about. Very much so. One could compare it, uh, to some degree at any rate, to the attempt by Hitler in 1923 to overthrow the system, in which Hitler was very quickly dealt with and jailed. 10 years later, of course, it was very different. So one could compare it with it, but uh, it's much more of a shambles than what happened in that time. We have to say that this is a very different time. Nonetheless, the factors within the system remain. It was capitalist then, it's capitalist today. The system is under threat. And you have a far right with Donald Trump at work. So it has a similarity. It's unlikely to go the same way, largely because we've progressed somewhat further than was there at the time in certain ways, and are much more backward in other ways. Anyway, the question of decline has been discussed by the left for many years. It was first put forward, of course, by Lenin in his work on imperialism. If you look at what he called decline, not many people would disagree in calling it a horrendous state of affairs. But he begins in 1870, and I think it's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. In 1870, when the powers in Europe conquered other parts of the world, and the most devastating example has been that of the Congo, where the Belgians invaded and something like 10 million people were killed in the Congo, were wiped out. The British and the Germans invaded Africa as well. The numbers of people who were killed ran into millions. Now, Lenin takes that as the beginning period of decline. The reason is that the impulse came from a decline within capitalism itself. That is to say, that in terms of profits, it made more sense to go overseas than simply to invest internally. The export of capital was the feature of that period onward. Of course, it's still the case, except that the present form is not identical. If anything, in certain respects, it appears to result in a better position for the home country, but it's a direct flow of capital from the third world today that now exists. And that's to say that if we looking at the economic situation and the interflows of the present, obviously we don't have the invasion of Britain and Germany and the other countries into Africa or South America or Asia, but instead we have the ruling class or the middle class in third world countries exporting their own profits to the developed countries, or there are existing investments in the third world which produce a substantial return which come to the first world. The balance of payments in the United States, of course, is the simple balance of payments, I mean, the amount that they're spending overseas and the amount they're immediately getting back, gives them a deficit of up to 60 billion, which in large part is paid for by returns from the rest of the world. So that feature of capitalism basically was extended, you can say, or to some degree established in this period from 1870 onwards, and has continued to the present day, but not in that form. As to say, British troops have been withdrawn. There may be American troops throughout the world, but I'd have to go on. I will go on to talk about that. But I think the Belgian king has apologized for what happened there. So it's not identical to what existed then. And I'm not certain whether one could draw a straight line from one to the other. However, if one's talking of decline, the point is that capitalism reached a certain stage in 1870 onwards, where in order to maintain its rate of profit or to increase it, it simply had to expand overseas. It couldn't simply continue as it did. The rate of profit was falling. That need to invest outside the home country has continued down to present day, but as I've just indicated, it's not identical in form. But it's this that started Lenin or what Lenin started with in his book on imperialism, the last stage of capitalism. Of course, if we look at it straightforwardly today, what we see instead in the place of that expansion, which was seen as part of decline, and of course insofar as capitalism had escalated to the point where it was killing millions of people, there's no question about it being in decline, and certainly having to be overthrown. But if we look at it today, we don't have exactly the same form, of course. France has its troops in North Africa, but in general the troops have been withdrawn. Britain has withdrawn its troops. Not everywhere, but in general has withdrawn its troops. Again, the reason behind that isn't simply a question of the development of the means of production, as it were, and a certain shift to the colonial world and a degree of independence, moving to the world which is still closely connected to the first world, so-called. But what has also happened, of course, in this period, in the 150 years involved, has been a change in the imperial power. Whereas at that time it was Britain above all, but together with other European powers. Today it is the United States, and Britain is a subordinate power to the United States. Today we have what's called globalism, under which the United States is the ruling power. It doesn't get up and declare itself a colonial power. That isn't regarded as right. Instead, it calls itself globalist. And the methods of control are different, obviously. Although troops are still used, as we've seen very recently in the Middle East, in Iraq, etc. So, but it's becoming increasingly difficult for the United States to simply send its troops, as it did immediately after the war, to various countries. And of course, again, this aspect of using troops to control has become more difficult. We saw this in 1956 when Britain tried to invade the Suez Canal to reassert its control of the Suez Canal, and then effectively lost it. But it lost it not because Egypt was able to throw them out, but because the United States did not accept it. So that effectively that part of the world fell to the United States as the overall global power, with a degree of independence being given to Egypt. So when we're talking of decline, in this respect, it was a decline of the initial colonial powers, mainly Britain. And it has, of course, declined to a much lower level. The United States has taken over, and it's generally accepted as the global power. The peculiarity of the present time, of course, since we live in a time when that globalism was actually challenged not just by left-wing forces in the countries which are globally subject, but by Donald Trump, who in his far-right way recognized that it made more sense at one level to abandon the globalist aspect and return to a direct colonial control. That's what it actually amounts to. If you look at his attitude to China, directly threatening it, it was as the global power threatening another power, but it's doing it in an individual basis, so making it not globalist, as it were, but straightforward colonialism on the part of the United States in relation to China, telling China that it could go so far and no further, and that was finished. No discussion. That is where they are. Now, China had indeed gone much further than the US capitalist class wanted it to go. And Trump took direct measures, as it were, whereas I imagine the new President Biden will do it in a more subtle form. But it is in fact too late to control China. So in that respect, as far as I can see, the attempt to restore the control of the United States simply won't work. And in that respect, as it were, one could say there appears to be somewhat less of what one can call a decline and much more of a change. So one really has to ask what is going on in that particular respect. Of course, it's not just China. In an earlier period, in 1991-92, when the Soviet Union was overthrown, the United States effectively walked in. And the indigenous would-be capitalists within the former Soviet Union, such as say in Russia, were told in no uncertain terms that they would not be allowed to be a world power. The United States made it quite clear. The result was that the possibility of firms in in Russia becoming international firms in the same way as some British firms or and mostly United States firms. And today, of course, there are Chinese firms in this position. But the Russians were not allowed to do it. Finished. The result was that Russia itself is finished. If you look at it today, what's actually left with it? It's mainly an oil power. It hasn't got very much else. Before 1991, before it switched from being the Soviet Union, it had a whole series of factories which were not competitive with the United States, but they were producing the goods. They were inferior goods, they were inefficient. It took a long time to produce them, much longer than it would in the United States or Britain or whatever, but they did produce a result. They did function. They did not function well. Some did, of course, but they were not allowed to continue. They were wiped out, effectively. Now, this reflects the period. It's a period in which the United States effectively does not accept competition. Whereas in the earlier period, before 1870, there obviously was competition between France, Britain, Germany, and so forth, and somewhat later it was still there up to a point. In this period, there's no question there's a global power, and that is the United States. And because it was cracking, Trump took, or the people behind Trump presumably, took the obvious step of abandoning a simple globalism and maintaining what amounted to a very similar position to what a colonial power would hold. The United States, well, under Trump, of course, but has made it clear to China that it has to withdraw its investments in the United States and its attempt, invited in fact by the United States, to invest in the stock exchange of the United States is now under question. I think they've been given 3 years in which to change. I don't know what the companies are actually going to do, but that is what's happening. It reflects a decline, of course, in the United States and a growth in the case of China. Well, since I've got that far, I briefly have to refer to China. If one looks at the world today, it remains a world with a hegemonic power, the United States. It's still the hegemonic power, but it's clearly under challenge by China. China is inferior in economic terms, considerably inferior to the United States. It's unlikely to catch up if one reads the literature for a period of years, say 20 or 30 years. Maybe in 20, more likely 30. But it's the way it's going, in spite of the attempt by the United States to ring fence them, they are likely to get there, it would seem. Anyway, the way this relates to decline is that what one's talking about is a situation where the United States is clearly in decline today. Got massive balance of payments deficit made up by money coming into the country from the rest of the world. It's had to try, and Trump has done it, but to a large degree he was supported by the US capitalist class. And the United States has tried to stop competition directly. So, and of course it did so in the case of Russia. So we're in clearly a period in this respect of capitalist decline, in which capitalism cannot accept competition. Now, that in fact was already true 100 years ago, one way or another, but in a different form. When one's talking about decline, the forms of decline have been changing, not 100%, but changing the way I've just been discussing. And what I've tried to do is discuss it in terms of the present, having referred also to the beginning of the period, which is called the period of decline by Lenin. I can't just talk about decline without describing the actual period in other terms as well. Historically, if we look at it, the concept of decline within Marxism became associated with the question of transition, because the period itself is overtaken by the Russian Revolution of 1917, which changed, of course, the whole aspect of the global economy. So, and Lenin, Trotsky, etc., regarded the taking of power in Russia as the opening up of the move to socialism. And indeed, I think today we still regard it as such, that it was possible under certain circumstances for the revolution to have spread, most notably to Germany. Of course, it did to Hungary, and of course there was a revolt in part of Germany. However, it was not successful. The conclusion was that capitalism was in decline, and from now onwards we were in a transition period. You can't therefore separate, as a Marxist, the transition period from the period of decline. You have a period of decline of capitalism, and the coming into being of socialism in the long run, and in the meantime we have a transition period in which the right and left fight, in which there is a transition, not just in certain aspects of taking power. That's to say, you get odd instances like in Cuba or Venezuela or wherever where a communist party might take power. But in these instances, up to now, we have not had a direct move to socialism. We can't regard Cuba as socialist, or Venezuela, or any other country. There are no other socialist countries. And you can't regard China, whatever it regards itself as, or what the government regards it as. You certainly can't regard it as socialist. Of course, the government in China doesn't regard itself as socialist, but as building socialism. Well, that is obviously in question. Between 60 and 80% today of the Chinese economy is private. And of course there is private investment from other countries in China today. If we look at it again in terms of global monopoly, which is another aspect of decline, what we see today as a degree of monopoly which the orthodox economics textbooks don't even acknowledge exists. Of course, Friedman declared that monopoly didn't exist. I think in orthodox economics, they are now admitting that it does exist. However, for 50 years, and anybody who did an economics course would hear that it didn't exist. Well, we now have three asset management companies which have obviously an enormous influence in the United States. BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, and there are a few more, Fidelity. And you even have one alliance which is really owned by Germany. Anyway, it's BlackRock, I think, has assets of over 7 trillion. So we're talking of clear operation of what really amounts to monopoly power within the United States, which is the global power. And there's it's a new form of it. It's not that monopoly didn't exist before, it's just that monopoly was declared by orthodox economics not to exist. And therefore, officially in the textbooks, it didn't exist. It's now being restored to the doctrine is now being overthrown, I think, within orthodox economics. Anyway, the point is that if we look at the present day as compared to an earlier period, then we see, just as Lenin did see, the rise of monopoly power, which discussed by Hillel Ticktin, of course, and by Lenin in his book on imperialism. Today it has gone even further effectively than it did in that period. If one looks at it in those terms, it is hard to believe that it could be in such a simple form, but it is. The point here then is that the original argument in Decline made by Lenin included the concept of the rise of monopoly power and a consequent decline in the whole nature of capitalism itself. Let's say with the absence of competition, you no longer would have a series of features which follow from a competition. You simply had monopoly. Well, it's fairly obvious that it has existed. It simply extended itself today, and has a considerable influence in government, as we've seen very recently, or would have had a kind. It's not very clear exactly what is behind it in the United States. The fact that in this very recent election, you actually had a meeting of with Stephen Schwarzman, a billionaire who owns a company, I think, which is worth 250 billion, who was called to a meeting after the 3rd of December, effectively to try and undo the election of Biden. That's the kind of world it would appear that we're in, with the monopoly power, as it were, showing itself politically. Obviously, one could talk much more about that, and quite evidently, it has existed before. The point is that we are in a situation in which is not very different, in essence, from what was described by Lenin as a period of decline of capitalism itself. So now the point I was just making is we're in decline and transition. Transition because there there has been an attempt to take power in Russia that turned into something else. But the various forms which have come into existence are a mixture of forms, partly of a change in capitalism and partly with a possibility of going further. And I think that's the way one would have to look at China itself today, or some of these other countries which have come into existence, which are not socialist, which are Stalinoid. But it is, of course, more than that, and one can go into a very considerable amount of detail about the degree of planning that we now have within the market. It was Preobrazhensky who argued that the transitional period is one in which there is an ongoing conflict between planning and the market. So that one of the major aspects of this decline is this conflict between a proto-planning and the market. It's fairly obvious if we look around, if we look at the large companies, that they are not one-man companies today, and the board of directors can't work by itself. It has to have a management, etc. So that increasingly, if one were to have a socialist society, all you would need to do is just remove one or two people at the top, and the rest would simply run it as a bureaucratic entity. In other words, the society itself is changing, but it's not socialist. It remains hierarchical, and it remains a society in which a small number of people have very high salaries, and the rest have a fixed salary, or even a declining salary. In other words, the form of transition is there, but the actual transition to socialism itself is stalled. Capitalism is changing, and it's when you call it, it's a changing or transitional capitalism, but it's not socialism. The path to progress is socialist. It's clear, but it isn't socialist. And in that sense, the original conflict between planning and the market remains, but it remains in this proto-form without actually crossing the line. That is effectively the second aspect of this decline. It is a real decline of capital as capital, but it's not an introduction of socialism itself. You could say that the forms of socialism, of planning, in a simpler or more corrupt or not non-socialist form have come into being. And we can see the outlines of what could be socialist, but it's not there. Well, at the same time, the justification for a few people to run the society in this form continues to wither away. The last 40 years, from 1980 to 1920, have been a complete failure from the point of view of capitalism. It was a deliberate attempt to reverse what had come into being and to try and prevent any move towards socialism. That has effectively failed. And if we look at it in the last 12 years, we've been in a downturn. It's exactly parallel to the Great Depression. The standard of living has dropped considerably throughout the world, except in China, I presume. but in general, it has dropped. This, in this period, it's very easy to talk of decline. When I first was involved with giving a talk on decline, which was in the early 80s. I remember doing it under critique in London. I chaired a session, and I was the only person of the 30 people in that group who supported the theory of decline. All the rest were, of course, left-wing or Marxist, but they rejected the concept of decline. That's clearly not possible today. It looks like decline. 12 years with low or zero profits in this period. 12 years of what amounts to increasing monopoly, not decreasing monopoly. And 12 years of the standard of living in Britain and America, etc., going down. And it's a period where in the third world the situation is getting worse and worse. It's catastrophic, in fact, today. So it's hard not to talk of decline. In the 1880s, it was virtually impossible. You would be regarded as a nutcase. So I think we can say that intellectually things have changed quite considerably. There's no question that capitalism is in trouble, and we can trace the trouble over time. The question of what system is in China is something else. I don't think it's socialist. It had much to do with socialism. But it is still a question. However, the push towards socialism is now considerably stronger than it was as the only alternative. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Hillel. I've got